And this is the thing that the markets and investors are not ready for. Inflation is going to come down fast. There's even some danger of deflation and a major U.S. recession in 2023. And no one's ready for that. I mean, people talk about recession, but it's going to be worse than they think.
And then they ramp up the printing press again, Jim.
Yes, but it doesn't work. $9 trillion of QE didn't do any good. I mean, how does the Fed do QE? They buy bonds from banks, give the money to the banks give it back to the Fed as excess reserves. What does that do for the economy? Nothing. Zero rates, again, it doesn't work. They don't have the tools. They're preparing for what we're talking about, which is a world where the dollar as a reserve currency will not be deposed overnight. But as a payment currency, there's a difference between a reserve currency and a payment currency. Anything can be a payment currency. If I want to pay you with baseball cards and bottle caps and you're okay with that, then it's a currency. So when we see the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, OPEC Plus, China individually, all these countries are the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Putin's answer to the EU. All of these organizations are working on new payment systems right now, and they're going to start to roll them out this year and later. So that's going to be a radical change in how we pay for things. It's still the dollar, so a digital dollar is still a dollar, a digital Chinese yuan is still a yuan, a digital euro is still a euro. So it's not a new currency, but it is a new payment channel, and it is a new form of the currency, if you want to think of it that way, even though it's still the dollar. And it goes hand in hand with getting rid of cash. In other words, I'll spend, in a minute, we'll get into what the central bank digital currency, what the hidden agenda is behind that. But as I go through the list of really bad things that can happen, you say, well, okay, but I still got cash. I can go down to the bank and get whatever, $10,000 or $100,000 in cash. By the way, that's not easy to do. So they have to not only push the digital currency agenda, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they have to get rid of cash, because as long as you have cash, you can do an end run around this. So these two things are coming down the track pretty fast. The central bank digital currency. It's not a cryptocurrency. It's not on a blockchain. A blockchain is just a ledger. They've been around since the 80s, no big deal. But this ledger will be maintained by somebody, probably the Federal Reserve. But, there could be a new government agency doing it. It's kind of like a bank account. So we might quickly end up in a world where, I have an account at a bank. You guys have accounts at banks. Well, those banks are either members of the Federal Reserve System, or they're smaller banks that are correspondents of bigger banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System, like Bank of America. The banks kind of keep all the books. We might be in a world where you would have an account at the Fed. Kim and Robert and I and everyone listening would have an account at the Fed. We'd have it on our iPhone or our Samsung or whatever our mobile phone is. And if I send you money, the Fed takes it out of my account and sends it to your account. End of story. Kind of like a Venmo type of thing with, larger denominations, etc. That has implications in terms of disintermediating the banks. Like, if you can do that, which you can technically, who needs banks? Ukraine, Russia, and using natural gas as a weapon. Now, this wasn't 2014 when they took Crimea, or 2020 when the invasion was being prepared, or 2022 when it broke out. This was 2011. So 11 years ago, I was saying, this is going to be used as a weapon, and here it comes. So it's kind of interesting that the war was completely unnecessary, and like you say, you saw it coming 10 years away. You have to actually consider the hidden agenda. It's basically an order that accelerates the U.S. movement towards a central bank digital currency, so-called CBDC. These are happening all over the world. Beijing already has one. They're past the prototype stage. They kind of rolled that out during the Winter Olympics, last February. And believe it or not, the Bahamas has a digital currency. There are a few other countries that have already gone in that direction. Europe is, the European Central Bank is very far along. We're in a recession now, and people say, what about the third quarter? And it's interesting because I do put some weight on the Atlanta Fed GDP now. I do think it's a very good tool. They miss sometimes. They're not always accurate, but it's the best tool out there. But very few people understand their statistical technique. Because what Wall Street does, you get a whole bunch of components for GDP, and they come in at different times with different lags, and you add them all up, and you get GDP. And what Wall Street does, they look at what they have, and they project all the rest based on regressions and correlations, which, don't necessarily hold up. But here's what we think. Here's our forecast for third quarter GDP based on projections of what we don't know. Atlanta doesn't do that. Atlanta takes what we do know, hard data, and they ask a different question. They say, what would GDP be now if this was all we had? And they put out a number. But they don't guess at the stuff they don't have. And it fills in as it goes along. So it's much more Bayesian in that sense. But because of how the data comes out, the time sequence to which the data comes out, it typically fades as the quarter goes on. It's not because they're using bad methodology. It's just because that's how they do it. And so just in the last week, 9 days or so, it went, everyone was cheering. I think with September 1st, it was 2.3%, maybe a little higher, but about 2.3%. 2 days later, it was 1.6, and now it's down to 1.3. There are two major sources of inflation potentially. One is the supply side. So supply shortages, supply chain disruptions, the kind of things we've been talking about. That's called cost push inflation. Costs go up and it gets pushed onto the consumer. The other source is demand, what's called demand pull inflation, which is more psychological. Consumers are thinking about choices and they say, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. I was going to wait 6 months, but hey, the price is going up. I better go buy it now before the price goes up. In the 1970s, we had both. We started with cost push from the Arab oil embargo, but it flipped into demand pull in the late 70s, and it just spun out of control, and Paul Volcker had to crush it. Today, the inflation is coming from the supply side. Some of the things we talked about, higher fuel costs. Everything has to be transported, so fuel is part of everything. It gets built into the price of everything. And there are other shortages and bottlenecks and costs that have to be taken up by manufacturers and distributors. So that's real. I'm not saying inflation isn't real, but it hasn't leached over onto the demand side. The psychology of consumers is not, I better buy it today because the price is going to go up. It's like, no, I better save money today or watch my budget, etc. And here's the difference. Demand pull inflation feeds on itself. The more of it you get, the more of it you get. It does spin out of control. So the cost push inflation from the supply side tends to be self-negating. You're not going to spend on dinner or a concert ticket or a vacation or a new dress or a new suit of clothes or whatever it may be. So that tends to, and so here's the Fed trying to deal with inflation, but they're dealing with it from the supply side. The Fed doesn't drill for oil. They don't drive trucks. They don't grow crops. They don't